Dear parent, what if I told you that every time you step in to do something for your child that they are capable of doing themselves, you are not just helping them in that moment, you are shaping the architecture of how their brain will function for the rest of their life? And I say that with deep compassion because I lived this in my own home. When you are busy, when your child is struggling, when it feels easier, faster, and far less emotionally exhausting to just pick up the laundry, clean the room, or handle the task yourself, it makes sense why parents fall into that pattern. It reduces friction in the moment. It keeps the household moving. It avoids the eye rolls, the resistance, the negotiation, and the emotional pushback. But what we don't always see is that in removing that short-term discomfort, we are also removing one of the most critical developmental opportunities a child has to build the internal skills required for adulthood. Because chores are not about cleanliness, they are not about control, they are not about keeping your house looking a certain way. Chores are about neurological development. They are about building the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for planning, organization, sequencing, impulse control, follow-through, and decision-making. When we repeatedly take over tasks, we are not just helping, we are interrupting the repetition required for those neural pathways to strengthen. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, ADHD parenting strategist and family systems coach. This podcast was created to help parents, partners, and families truly understand what is happening underneath the behaviors they are seeing every day so you can respond with clarity, structure, and confidence instead of confusion, frustration, or reactivity. Because when we understand the why behind the behavior, everything about how we respond begins to shift. I specialize in ADHD, executive functioning, emotional regulation, and the family system patterns that keep households stuck in cycles of chaos, miscommunication, and feeling overwhelmed. My work is focused on helping families move out of reaction and into intentional, structured, solution-focused living that actually works in real life. I'm also a mom to a now thriving 23-year-old son who is a self-taught multi-instrumentalist, singer, and songwriter, and I've been married to my husband for over 3 decades. So what you're getting here is not just clinical insight or theory, you are getting lived experience combined with professional training. You are hearing what actually works. Let's dive in. When a child participates in chores, they are engaging in what we call executive functioning, which refers to the brain's ability to manage itself and its tasks. This includes skills like task initiation, which is the ability to start something without excessive delay, working memory, which is the ability to hold and manipulate information in the moment, and cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to shift between tasks or adapt when something doesn't go as planned. For a child with ADHD in particular, these skills are not naturally strong, which is why they must be built through repeated, structured, real-life practice. When a child cleans their room, they are not just cleaning. They are making decisions about where to start, what to prioritize, how to sequence actions, and how to sustain effort over time. For example, when a child walks into a messy bedroom, their brain is required to scan the environment and decide, do I start with the clothes on the floor? Do I make the bed first? Or do I pick up the trash? That moment of decision-making is where executive functioning is being activated. If a parent consistently steps in and either directs every step or completes the task entirely, the child never builds the ability to tolerate that internal pause, that confusion, or that uncertainty. Over time, this leads to what we often see in young adults, which is task paralysis, where they stand in front of a task and genuinely do not know how to begin, not because they are unwilling, but because they have not had enough repetitions of figuring it out. This also connects directly to task initiation, which is one of the most impaired areas for individuals with ADHD. Task initiation is the ability to move from a state of rest into a state of action. And many children experience what is called task inertia, which is a neurological difficulty in getting started. Chores provide repeated, low-stakes opportunities to practice starting. For example, when a child hears, "First put away your laundry, then you can have screen time," their brain begins to build an association between effort and reward. Over time, this becomes a behavioral loop, where the brain starts to expect that effort precedes access to preferred activities. If this is not practiced, what we often see later is a young adult who delays, avoids, or procrastinates, not because they don't care, but because their brain has not been trained to initiate action without immediate motivation. You will see this in real life when a young adult avoids sending an email, avoids applying for jobs, or avoids making necessary phone calls. It is not a character flaw. It is a skill deficit that traces back to a lack of repeated practice in starting tasks when they were younger. Another critical psychological component that chores develop is emotional regulation, which is the ability to manage internal emotional states such as frustration, boredom, and resistance. Chores are inherently non-preferred tasks, which means they do not provide a strong dopamine response. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter associated with motivation and reward, and children, especially those with ADHD, are highly driven by dopamine. When a child completes a task that is not inherently rewarding, they are building what we call distress tolerance, which is the ability to stay engaged in an activity even when it is not enjoyable. For example, when a child is sweeping the floor and becomes bored halfway through but continues until completion, they are strengthening their ability to tolerate discomfort. When a teen is doing laundry and feels frustrated but finishes the process, they are building persistence. When this is practiced over time, it translates into real-world resilience. Without this practice, what we often see is a pattern of avoidance, where the individual gravitates only toward high dopamine activities like gaming, scrolling, or substance use, and avoids anything that requires sustained effort without immediate reward. This is why chores are so critical. They provide structured exposure to low dopamine tasks, which builds the brain's capacity to function in the real world. Chores also play a significant role in identity formation within the family system. In family systems theory, every member of the household occupies a role, and those roles shape how individuals see themselves and how they function in relationships. When a child is not expected to contribute, they often take on the role of the consumer, the one who receives, while the parent becomes the over-functioner, the one who does everything. This dynamic may feel manageable in childhood, but it creates a significant imbalance over time. When a child participates in chores, they begin to internalize a different identity, which is, I am someone who contributes. I am part of this system. I have value here. For example, a child who sets the table every night begins to see themselves as part of the functioning of the household. A teen who cooks one meal a week begins to understand what it means to provide for others. This directly impacts how they show up later in relationships, in college, and in the workplace. Without this, we often see young adults who enter relationships expecting to be taken care of rather than understanding how to contribute, which can lead to significant relational strain. One of the most concerning psychological outcomes of not assigning chores is the development of learned helplessness, which is a condition where an individual believes they are incapable of completing tasks, even when they have the ability to do so. This occurs when children are repeatedly rescued from effort or discomfort. For example, when a child says, "I don't know how to clean my room," and the parent steps in and does it for them, the brain encodes the belief, "I can't do this." When a teen avoids learning how to cook and the parent continues to provide meals, the belief becomes, "I don't need to learn this." Over time, this builds into a broader identity of incapability. By the time this individual reaches young adulthood, they may feel overwhelmed by basic life tasks, such as managing a schedule, maintaining a living space, or handling responsibilities independently. This is not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack the lived experience of doing, trying, failing, and figuring it out. Chores disrupt this pattern by providing repeated evidence that I can do hard things even if I don't want to, even if it's not perfect, and even if it takes time. If chores are not introduced early and consistently, the long-term outcome is not neutrality. It is a very specific developmental trajectory. You will often see a young adult who struggles with follow-through, who becomes easily overwhelmed by multi-step tasks, who avoids responsibilities that require sustained effort, and who relies heavily on external support to function. This can show up as difficulty maintaining employment, difficulty managing finances, difficulty living independently, and difficulty contributing in relationships. These individuals may appear capable on the surface, but underneath, they lack the internal systems that support consistent action. They may procrastinate, avoid, or shut down when faced with responsibility, not because they are unwilling, but because their brain has not been trained to manage those demands. In contrast, a child who grows up with consistent, age-appropriate chores develops a very different internal structure. They become someone who can start tasks, tolerate discomfort, follow through, and contribute meaningfully to their environment. They build confidence not through praise alone, but through repeated experiences of capability. Starting young is critical because of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change and adapt based on experience. In early childhood, the brain is highly malleable, which means that repeated behaviors quickly become ingrained patterns. When young children are introduced to simple responsibilities such as picking up toys or helping set the table, they are not just learning tasks. They are learning that contributing is a normal part of being in a family. As they grow into school-age children, these tasks become more structured, requiring sequencing, organization, and follow-through. By adolescence, chores should begin to mirror real-life responsibilities, such as managing laundry, preparing meals, and understanding basic financial concepts. Each stage builds on the previous one, creating a developmental progression that prepares the individual for adulthood. When this progression is skipped or delayed, the gap becomes more difficult to close later. So when your child resists chores, when they complain, when it feels like it would be so much easier to just do it yourself, I want you to reframe that moment. That is not a disruption. That is not an inconvenience. That is the work. That is the exact moment where growth is happening. Every time they push through, every time they complete a task, every time they figure something out, they are strengthening the neural pathways that will allow them to function independently in the future. You are not just raising a child who can clean a room. You are raising a future adult who can manage a life. And that is why chores are not optional. They are foundational. This episode is for educational purposes and to provide support. It is not a substitute for professional mental health evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment. The more we learn to recognize what is happening underneath the behaviors, the more compassion, structure, and effective support we can offer to our kids, our partners, and ourselves. Because behavior is never random. It is always communicating something, and when we learn how to read it accurately, we can respond in ways that actually create change. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this episode was helpful, I would truly appreciate it if you shared it with a parent, partner, or educator who may need this perspective and these tools. You can also subscribe so you don't miss future episodes and explore additional resources, tools, and support at thepathtopecetherapy.com. If you are in California, I offer virtual sessions if you are outside of the Hermosa Beach and South Bay area, and you can book directly through my website. You can also reach me by email at stephanieb@thepathtopecetherapy.com. And as always, take a deep breath, give yourself some grace, and remember, peace is possible and you don't have to do this alone.